There are several different layers to this documentary entitled Conspiracy of Silence, and with every layer, the story gets worse and worse. So the only way that I could fully explain this is to discuss each layer and then peel it off like an onion and expose the layer underneath. And when we finally get to the core of the matter, you will see that the establishment is not only frauds, but they are extremely psychotic. So first, let's go over the terrible way Senator Lauren Schmidt and Attorney John DeCamp handled this case for the State Legislative Committee. So as I said in the previous episode of Kings of the Occult, I believe that when the parents of the children came forward, when the foster parents and the foster children came forward to take legal action against this pedophile ring, and they got nowhere with the Omaha Police Department, and they got nowhere with the FBI, the parents decided to write their senator and request help from the Senate in this matter that the police and the FBI were refusing to help with. So according to the Conspiracy of Silence documentary, the Senate formed a team to investigate this pedophile ring, and it was headed by Senator Lauren Schmidt. And the first thing that this team did was interview the Foster Care Review Board director about the children's sexual abuse allegations. Then this legislative committee, quote, hired special legal counsel, which included Attorney John DeCamp, and they also hired a private investigator named Gary Caradori. And it was Gary Caradori who supposedly went on the streets of Omaha, Nebraska, asking questions, and he found 3 witnesses who would testify about the pedophile and drug dealing ring. And those witnesses that he found were Troy Bonner, Paul Benacci, and Alicia Owen. So as we already covered, Troy Bonner was a self-admitted heroin addict who refused to come through in court. Paul Benacci was a child molester who was in jail for molesting his little cousin when Attorney John DeCamp went to interview him. And Paul Benacci admitted to working for Larry King and hunting down children to lure to these pedophile parties. And Alicia Owens was described on several websites as saying that she was flown all over the country in Larry King's private jets to act as both a prostitute and a drug courier for Larry King. So it sounds like she was something of a drug dealer. And drugs was the major way that these pedophiles would lure these young children to their houses where these crimes would take place. And they did this by using people like Alicia Owen and Paul Benacci to offer the children drugs, get the children addicted to the drugs, and then say, if you want more drugs, come to these parties. So Troy Bonner, Paul Benacci, and Alicia Owen were the witnesses that this legislative committee found and chose to work with. And all of these witnesses seem to have worked for Larry King and the pedophile ring. So the next thing that this legislative committee did was interview Troy Bonner, Paul Benacci, and Alicia Owen on videotape, and they gave their testimonies concerning the pedophile ring. Then, later, in the Conspiracy of Silence documentary, the narrator states that, quote, John DeCamp then advised Senator Lauren Schmidt to give the videotape testimonies of Troy Bonner, Paul Benacci, and Alicia Owen to the FBI. And immediately, the FBI leaked those videotapes to a hostile media who instantly began to attack the witnesses on the news. And the news did that because the pedophiles that were named were rich and influential people. So my first question is, why would John DeCamp do that? Why would he get his witnesses to state everything that they knew on videotape so he could then give those videotapes to the FBI so the FBI could then sabotage his investigation and his upcoming court hearings. Attorney John DeCamp had been hired by the Legislative Committee because the FBI and the Omaha police refused to investigate this case. Senator Lauren Schmidt and the Legislative Committee had been formed due to the fact that the residents of Omaha were not receiving any help from the Omaha police or the FBI. So the FBI were basically the opposition to this legislative committee. So why would John DeCamp hand his evidence over to the people who are obviously trying to help cover this whole thing up? Then, next in the documentary, the narrator states that Troy Bonner was then brought in for questioning by the FBI, who told him that he would not be believed. And if he were to go on with his story, that Troy Bonner would go to jail. So due to the FBI's threats, Troy Bonner agrees to withdraw his video testimony. So my second question is, why is Troy Bonner even talking to the FBI at this point? Why would Troy Bonner's lawyer, who is John DeCamp, even allow that? With John DeCamp acting as Troy Bonner's lawyer, Troy Bonner did not even know his basic rights, which were his right to remain silent and his right to legal counsel. So at that point, if the FBI wanted to discuss the case out of court, they had to do so with John DeCamp, who was Troy Bonner's lawyer. That was the reason why the Legislative Committee hired attorney John DeCamp for his legal expertise. And one of the basic things lawyers should know is that you don't allow your witnesses to discuss anything outside of court, especially with the cops or the FBI who are trying to silence you. And you definitely do not talk to anyone without your lawyer present. So the first thing that John DeCamp should have told his witnesses is that after agreeing to become witnesses, you do not talk to the Omaha cops or the FBI or anyone besides me, your lawyer, about the case, because those are the people who are now against us. And if John DeCamp did that, Troy Bonner could not be intimidated by the police or by the FBI. But John DeCamp failed to do that. So he had one of his main witnesses getting interrogated and intimidated by the FBI. The quote from the documentary is, quote, "The FBI convinced Troy Bonner to withdraw his video testimony and attempted to use him to persuade his fellow witness, Alicia Owen, to abandoning her evidence about Larry King as well," end quote. Then, in the next scene of the documentary, John DeCamp is listening to an FBI recorded phone conversation between Troy Bonner and Alicia Owen, and they are arguing about Troy Bonner's fears about going to jail and being talked to every day by the FBI. So through that we find out that the FBI is repeatedly calling Troy Bonner in to interrogate him and harass him without his attorney present. So John DeCamp is probably the worst lawyer in the history of the world. Then the documentary vaguely describes the death of the private investigator Gary Caradori, whose small private airplane crashes after getting torn apart in the air somehow. And then for some reason, the FBI confiscates all of Gary Caradori's private records on the case. So we hear that, and then the narrator states that, quote, Troy Bonner claims that pressure from the FBI and with the assistance of the county attorney's office in Omaha led him to swear a new statement claiming that he and Alicia Owen concocted the entire child abuse story. And he told that to the grand jury that was formed to bring any charges against the pedophiles. So just to explain what a grand jury is. A grand jury is a court hearing that is basically a preliminary hearing that will figure out if the prosecution has a legitimate case against the people being accused, or if the whole case should just be abandoned. So at a grand jury hearing, the legislative committee, led by Senator Lauren Schmidt and Attorney John DeCamp, would act as the prosecution and would try to convince the grand jury that this case against these pedophiles should go to trial. So at a grand jury hearing, Senator Lauren Schmidt and Attorney John DeCamp and all of their witnesses should be heard, while the defendants, who are the pedophiles, will not be heard. So at a grand jury hearing, it's basically a hearing where the prosecution and Attorney John DeCamp have the upper hand. They called for this hearing because they want to go to trial. So they want to present all of their evidence to the grand jury and figure out what type of charges they could accuse these pedophiles of when they go to trial. So after this grand jury hearing, the Conspiracy of Silence documentary states that on July 23rd, 1990, the grand jury issued a bizarre and contradictory report. The court indicted Larry King for fraud and embezzlement and ruled that he had paid young men for sex, but dismissed allegations about him running a pedophile sex ring. 2. The court indicted Alan Baer for pandering for sex, but rejected evidence linking him to Larry King or Peter Citron. 3. The grand jury noted that Peter Citron had been found guilty of separate child molestation charges, I guess in another court case. Then, concerning the prosecution's witnesses for refusing to withdraw her evidence, the grand jury charged Alicia Owen with perjury. So suddenly, Alicia Owen goes from being a victim who was rightfully prosecuting her attackers to someone who is now being charged with a crime. So to remind everyone what John DeCamp allowed to happen at the grand jury hearing was that they allowed one of their main witnesses to get harassed and intimidated by the FBI until he was so scared that he got up at the grand jury hearing and said that he and another witness, Alicia Owen, had made up the whole story concerning the child abuse ring, and he wanted to withdraw everything that he said on videotape and any proof that he had. So again, the grand jury hearing is a hearing that is requested and controlled by the prosecution. This was John DeCamp's time to really make an impression on the court and the upcoming trial about prosecuting these pedophiles who are being named over and over again by children in the Omaha community. This hearing, this grand jury hearing, was John DeCamp's time to take a certain degree of power over the case. John DeCamp and his legislative committee should have every advantage at the grand jury hearing, but instead they allowed one of their main witnesses, Troy Bonner, to make a fool out of himself and out of their whole legal team. It was like a message to the grand jury that this was the best that the legislative committee could do. And if this was the best that they could do, then they were all crazy and should not be taken seriously. If Troy Bonner was going to sabotage their whole case, John DeCamp should have dismissed Troy Bonner from his group of witnesses and just used Alicia Owen and Paul Benacci. Troy Bonner should have just gone to work for the FBI to aid the pedophiles with their case. So that is quite a legislative sponsored legal team headed by attorney John DeCamp, that when he goes before the grand jury to see if he has a case against Larry King, Alan Baer, and Peter Citron, John DeCamp's proof includes one of his witnesses attacking another one of his witnesses who then gets charged with perjury. So under the guidance of Senator Lawrence Schmidt and attorney John DeCamp, they go from being the prosecution to the criminals. So this is the worst, the absolute worst legal team ever assembled in the history of mankind. So the next thing that they say in the documentary is that Senator Schmidt's legislative committee makes a report denouncing the grand jury, saying that the system failed both the victims and himself. So once again, it was Senator Lawrence Schmidt and attorney John DeCamp who had failed due to their insane and self-destructive legal team. It was almost as if they went out of their way to sabotage their own case because those two were working with the pedophiles. So after the grand jury hearing, the subsequent trial takes place a year later in July of 1991, and Troy Bonner returned to testify that he had completely made up the entire child abuse story, and that he and his fellow witness Alicia Owen had lied about the whole thing. So Alicia Owen was sentenced to between 9 and 25 years in prison for the charge of perjury or lying in court. Then their good old attorney, John DeCamp, is interviewed, and he says, I quote, "I can't find a case in the history of this country where some kid got a sentence to 9 to 25 years for something like this. If you want to pick a telesign that something is fishy about the whole thing, it was in the sentencing itself. For some reason, they had to send a signal to every kid who was a potential witness that if you dare come forward, if you dare talk, watch what happens." End quote. So there is John DeCamp further stating the exact message from the criminals in the Omaha Police Department and the FBI. If you are a victim of rich and influential pedophiles, then not even your Senate and not even the American court system can help you. So watch out, because it's pointless to stand up against these pedophiles. So with a lawyer like this, it's like having a member of the pedophile ring come and help you with your legal case. Meanwhile, concerning the pedophiles, Alan Baer was fined $500 for the reduced charge of aiding and abetting prostitution, and he pleaded no contest instead of a guilty plea so that he could not be sued. Peter Citron served 2 years of a 3 to 8 year sentence, and the documentary never states what Peter Citron was convicted for. We never hear what his charges are. And Larry King was given a 15-year sentence for the bank fraud of stealing $40 million from the Franklin Credit Union, but he was never charged for any sex crimes. Then, the next quote in the documentary concerning John DeCamp is this, and I quote the narrator, "John DeCamp, former state senator and Vietnam veteran, is now the only man fighting to help Larry King's victims. He is the lawyer trying to overturn the Alicia Owen conviction and to expose the cover-up." End quote. So after hearing that, we see that the first thing John DeCamp thinks to do is to go see Troy Bonner and convince Troy Bonner to go to court again and declare that he was lying when he said he made up the whole child abuse story. And by doing that, it will help Alicia Owen and her appeal so that she could get out of jail. So, if Troy Bonner was to do this, the court can easily accuse him of perjury because he is admitting to committing perjury. He's admitting to lying in court. So at this point, John DeCamp's legal strategy goes into the realm of complete insanity. After being intimidated by the FBI and switching sides right in the middle of a grand jury hearing, which gets his fellow witness locked up, why on earth would Troy Bonner then return to court and admit to committing perjury now? It's absurd to even believe that Troy will follow through with that. If, during the first time around, Troy Bonner did not even have the guts to face the possibility of being accused of perjury, then why would he now go and admit 100% to committing perjury? So it's like these two people, John DeCamp and Troy Bonner, are working together to sabotage the case, this time sabotaging the Alicia Owen appeal. So on the day of the Alicia Owen appeal, the big surprise is that Troy Bonner skips the court hearing and he goes into hiding. Then John DeCamp finds out that the county attorney has sent Troy Bonner a subpoena, and a subpoena is an order to appear in court. So for some reason this subpoena has scared Troy Bonner. So even though that he has agreed to come to court anyway, why have they sent him a subpoena ordering him to go to court? Why should this subpoena even matter to Troy Bonner? And it's because Troy Bonner has no idea what he is doing, and his lawyer John DeCamp is again allowing the state to mess with his head by sending Troy Bonner a scary legal document, a subpoena that Troy does not understand and obviously does not have a real attorney that can explain it to him. John DeCamp should have told him, if they send you anything like a subpoena, just bring it to me, or just throw it out and don't worry about it. It was a tactic that the state used, again, to intimidate or harass Troy Bonner. And John DeCamp was just so willing to let that happen again. So it's like John DeCamp has a big stupid kid that wants to do the right thing, and he wants to stand up against the pedophile ring. But his lawyer, John DeCamp, is allowing the FBI and now the state's attorney to intimidate him and confuse him at every opportunity. So then John DeCamp has another great quote on video. So I quote John DeCamp, "Every victim witness who has stepped forward in any way has either been killed, put in jail, terrified, or run out of the state or discredited, while every perpetrator, even the convicted ones, have been treated as conquering heroes." And as he says that, he says it in a way like he is impressed with the pedophiles. There is no conviction or anger at all when he says this. It's as if he is very pleased with this outcome. So John DeCamp is one hell of a lawyer that was chosen by the legislative committee to represent the good guys. I think the good guys could have done better by hiring Satan instead of John DeCamp to represent them. So at the end of the documentary, everything is still up in the air concerning the Alicia Owen appeal. And what is not explained is if Troy Bonner withdrew his testimony and said he made it all up, then why is Paul Benacci protected and Alicia Owen is not? That's never explained. And it is never explained, either in the Conspiracy of Silence documentary or by John DeCamp in any other videos or interviews, why Alicia Owen gets locked up for a 9 to 25 year sentence while Paul Benacci goes on to win $1 million lawsuit against Larry King. So I never really understood that part. I don't think he ever collected any money, but he was still awarded a $1 million lawsuit by the courts. At the conclusion of the Conspiracy of Silence documentary, John DeCamp and the director of the Conspiracy of Silence documentary then focused their complete attention on Paul Benacci, who was interviewed on video, and he says that the pedophile ring led from Omaha, Nebraska, all around the country, and even all the way to Washington, D.C., and to the White House. And there is a newspaper article written in the Washington Times that exposed a call boy ring in the area of Washington, D.C. And this call boy ring was operated out of a funeral home. newspaper article is entitled, "Homosexual Prostitution Inquiry Ensnares VIP with Reagan and Bush." So Paul Benacci tells John DeCamp that he was one of these call boys who were allowed in the White House, as written about in the Washington Times. So Paul Benacci says that he was flown to Washington, D.C. by Larry King, and then he was taken into the White House by a government lobbyist named Craig Spence. So all the attention has now shifted onto Paul Benacci, and the documentary just forgets about Alicia Owen. And I have noticed that in all the subsequent videos on this subject where John DeCamp is interviewed, he never mentions Alicia Owen once. The only people that DeCamp mentions is Paul Benacci, Rusty Nelson, and Troy Bonner. It's as if Alicia Owen was never even part of his case. Then in the 2007 Truthfire John DeCamp interview, John DeCamp is asked by the Truthfire interviewer, "Can you provide any updates on some of the principal people who were involved in exposing the Larry King pedophile ring?" So John DeCamp discusses Paul Benacci, and then he discusses Rusty Nelson, who was Larry King's photographer. And then John DeCamp even mentions Noreen Gosh, who was involved in a completely separate case. So John DeCamp doesn't even bring Alicia Owen up. It's as if Alicia Owen does not even exist in the mind of John DeCamp. The same thing with the Alex Jones John DeCamp interview. John DeCamp is interviewed extensively by Alex Jones about the Larry King pedophile ring, and John DeCamp never discusses Alicia Owen once. Her name does not come up once. And why this is very important is because, like I said at the start of this, Alicia Owen was hardly mentioned in the original Conspiracy of Silence documentary that I saw around 2007. In the original version that I saw around 2007, there was never any video of Alicia Owen that I remember. It was like they made an attempt not to include her in the documentary at all. In 2007, I must have watched the Conspiracy of Silence documentary several times. And the only thing I remember about Alicia Owen is the audio tape conversation where she is arguing with Troy Bonner about the upcoming court case. And the only thing mentioned about Alicia Owen was that after getting arrested for perjury, Alicia Owen spent more time in solitary confinement than any other woman in the history of Nebraska. So in that 2007 version, it was presented as if Alicia Owen had been involved in a separate case that was not handled by John DeCamp. In the 2007 version of this documentary, it was presented as if John DeCamp had represented Troy Bonner and Paul Benacci, but not Alicia Owen. For some reason, the Conspiracy of Silence documentary has been re-edited to now include more information and more video of Alicia Owen being convicted of perjury. The entire scene of John DeCamp sitting down with Alicia Owen at a table and discussing her appeal is new to the Conspiracy of Silence documentary on the internet in 2020. In the original version that I saw in 2007, it did not seem like John DeCamp had anything to do with Alicia Owen at all. I don't even remember seeing what the woman looked like. So what is funny is that many years later, in the year 2014, I started thinking about the Conspiracy of Silence documentary again. And I began thinking about Alicia Owen and how they had said that she had gotten locked up and spent more time in solitary confinement than any other female in the history of Nebraska. So I tried looking up information on the internet about the current state of Alicia Owen. And in 2014, there was nothing new on the internet. And I did a search for her name on Google Images, and the only photograph I could find was this, very blurry one. So I kept this photograph because I believed it to be very rare. So around that time, in 2014, I began to realize that John DeCamp had really screwed up the case by deciding to work with Troy Bonner, who had gotten scared and then failed to show up in court. At the end of the original Conspiracy of Silence documentary that I saw in 2007, the conclusion was that Troy Bonner had realized that his cowardice had messed up the whole court case, but now he was willing to go back to court to redeem himself. And after saying something like that on video, there was a camera shot of Troy Bonner lighting a cigarette and then looking up at the tall buildings of Omaha. And it's very dramatic, and it suggests that Troy Bonner is single-handedly going up against the giant powers of this city. And that was the way the 2007 version left it off with the court case. Could Troy Bonner, John DeCamp's star witness, go back to court, set the record straight, and pull it all off? We wouldn't know. So at the end of the 2007 version, Troy Bonner had found some new strength in himself and was prepared to go to court and do what is right. But we would never know the outcome because that was where it stopped. So due to that, it took me a few years. But like I said, in 2014, I began to wonder why John DeCamp wanted to work with Troy Bonner, who was a drug addict and didn't want to show up to court. I would think that John DeCamp would go seek out Alicia Owen to stand trial as a witness because she seemed more motivated to do so. In that recorded conversation, she seemed like somebody who was strong and motivated, while Troy Bonner was full of doubt. But it was like John DeCamp had nothing to do with her at all. So I thought that she had a separate trial and her own attorney. So when I watched the Conspiracy of Silence documentary again in 2020, you can imagine my surprise when I saw the entire documentary had now been changed. So I began to realize that the Conspiracy of Silence documentary was more of an Eclipse news story. It is not necessarily a fake news story. It is an Eclipse news story. So people have to begin to understand the nature of an Eclipse news story. And an eclipse is a story generated by the media that usually comes up with a copycat story that is supposed to take the center stage of something that is already occurring. So, if some real people are trying to prosecute the pedophile ring in Omaha, the Senate, working with a series of actors, will suddenly get a lot of news coverage, and they will never mention anyone but their group of insiders. And those insiders are Senator Lauren Schmidt, lawyer John DeCamp, and witnesses Troy Bonner, Alicia Owen, and Paul Benacci. So imagine that you are a real person who has a case against a pedophile, and you are having trouble getting the police to investigate the suspects or do anything to help you. So you decide to write your senator and request help for them to get involved. And then suddenly you hear or you see on the news that the state's Senate is now getting involved in a case much like your own. And they have a senator leading a team of lawyers and witnesses. And they even have the support of a senator. I think that many people in the area may think that their letters had worked when writing the Senate. They may think that all of their efforts have paid off when suddenly something is happening that doesn't affect their case, but exposes an even larger case that is very similar to their own. So it is a psychological move by the government and by the FBI and by the military to silence all of the smaller cases in the area while their larger case takes center stage. And that is an eclipse. So it may start off as optimistic. people in the area who were affected by this pedophile ring may say, finally, there is a senator getting involved, and he has lawyers, and they have legislative committees, and they have private investigators, and they have witnesses, including people who had worked for the pedophile ring. And they all plan on bringing charges against some of these rich pedophiles and go to court. So they may be fooled into thinking that something is finally being done. So at first they may be optimistic about hearing that. So it may start off as optimistic and cause people to assume the role of a spectator instead of staying personally involved and doing their best to fight this thing. Their little court case is eclipsed by this larger one. So they begin to take a spectator position and they follow the coverage on the news. So then the media may release a story about the private investigator's plane going down. His plane mysteriously is pulled apart in midair, causing him to crash land, and he is killed. So that is a psychological attack that will exist to scare everybody who had cases of their own or wanted to act as witnesses. Now these powers are killing the private investigators that were hired by the Senate. Then a month or two later, they will hear another news story that now one of the main witnesses is now being accused of perjury, while another one of the main witnesses is withdrawing his whole testimony and claiming he made the whole thing up. So the public will watch on the news as this whole thing falls apart. So if a senator and his lawyer and his private investigators and his legislative committee can't go up against these people, then who can? And the answer is the American public can. The American public is the only ones who are motivated to do this right. They are the only ones that could take a stand and force the government to actually do their job. This group of insiders who are all paid off by the pedophiles are not going to do their job. They're going to do whatever they can to sabotage the whole thing, because there's a lot of money in pedophilia. There's a lot of money in human trafficking. And these rich elitists like it that they could call up a callboy ring and have children and teenagers dropped off at their house that they could use as slaves, that they could do whatever they want to. Unfortunately, there is a large segment of the American population that thinks that is a normal and acceptable way to live. And unfortunately, these elitists and their sick attitude has taken over all the positions of power, because they are greedy and they are self-centered and they want things their way. So that sort of attitude is what takes over. Regular people tend to be more passive. They tend to be more giving. They tend to be more trusting. So these greedy, egotistical, self-centered, and hateful people always seem to do better within the government and within corporations and within society. They say they have a killer instinct to take over. They think their lack of morals gives them strength. So that is what happens. But I'm going to tell you that these people become afraid when you stand up against them. When regular people stand up against them and force these institutions of government, force the court system, force the Senate, force everything they pay taxes to actually do their job. A lot of these people will have to do it. And that is because there are two forces in the universe. There's a very powerful force of evil, as everybody knows. But there is a very powerful force of good in the world too. And if these evil men and women were allowed to get away with all of their sick plans 100% of the time, this world would have turned into a flaming cesspool long ago. So believe me when I tell you, there is a fight going on. But if good people fail to stand up, then who will the powers of good work through? If everybody good wants to become passive and wants to be fooled by the forces of evil, and they are always willing to back down and sit down and let the forces of evil take over, then how do the forces of good in the universe, the forces that people call God or the angels in heaven, who do they assist? What do they do? If good people are always so passive and so trusting and so willing to be fooled and so willing to take a passenger role and just get in the back of the bus driven by pure evil, what do the forces of God and the angels in heaven do then? The next layer that we must uncover to expose the conspiracy of silence documentary is this. Many of the people shown in this documentary appear to be wearing masks or disguises. So we will start with Larry King. Here is Larry King singing the Star-Spangled Banner. And if you look at his face, especially around his mouth, he appears to be wearing a sophisticated latex mask that adheres to his face. So for an example of this, do a search for the movie entitled Big Mama's House that came out in the year 2000. And you could see that the faces appear the same with these latex masks on. Next is a quick camera shot of John DeCamp walking into his office. And he has a quick, rather noticeable way of walking. Notice the way that he swings his arm. And if you compare that video to this one of Larry King, you will see that they walk in the exact same way. So I realized that John DeCamp is playing the role of Larry King. So the Conspiracy of Silence documentary is a high-level counterintelligence video where agents of the CIA employ their tactics of using disguises to play several roles in a situation in order to have more control of that situation. As specialists in these operations, they want to control every angle to the case. These high-level pedophiles in the government can do this the best by acting in both roles as the prosecutors and also the ones being charged. So as I said before, John DeCamp is probably not a real senator. I read the documents that they had on his career in the Senate, and there was not a lot of information. And due to this, I feel that John DeCamp was a figure that the military establishment invented around the time of this child abuse incident in Omaha. The same is true with Senator Lauren Schmidt. I compared the video of Lauren Schmidt with the man identified as Monsignor Hop. And I believe that these two people are the same man playing both roles. Senator Lauren Schmidt wears a mask that makes him appear older when he plays the role of Monsignor Hop, who is a priest and manager at the Boys Town orphanage. So it is not clear about his actual position at Boys Town, but Monsignor Hop was supposedly a priest there when this incident happened involving Boys Town children being either invited or lured to pedophile drug parties controlled by Larry King. So in the documentary, Monsignor Hop is being interviewed and he is asked, quote, "Can you understand why a very detailed report from a social worker employed at Boys Town identifying children and identifying their alleged abusers never saw the light of day?" And Monsignor Hop replies, "No, I could not understand that. I would not put up with that. But did something like that happen? I don't know of it." So Monsignor Hop is portrayed as an old priest who seems kind of out of it. So as I said before, Senator Lauren Schmidt was the head of the legislative committee that was formed after the citizens of Omaha wrote their senator because the police and the FBI were refusing to help with these cases. It was briefly mentioned in this documentary that Father Val Peter, who was the head of Boys Town, also failed to investigate the reports from Boys Town from children who said that they were being abused. Father Val Peter's response was that some of the children filed a report with a social worker at Boys Town, but for some reason the children grew scared when they were told that the next step was to go discuss this directly with Father Val Peter. And at that point they refused, and the issue was dropped. So the only reason that I could think of why the children would do that is because Father Val Peter may have been one of the abusers that the children named. So they complained about the abuse to a social worker. And when they said, well, let's go talk to Father Val Peter and see what he has to say about it. And at that point, the children just dropped their complaint. So here is a short clip of Father Val Peter in a Boys Town infomercial.
I'm Father Val Peter, the caretaker of Father Flanagan Stream and the executive director of Boys Town. Does Boys Town really exist, people ask me? Does Boys Town really exist, people ask me? You bet it does. You bet it does. You bet it does.
So he says, does Boys Town exist? You bet it does. So you can notice his expression, which in my opinion seems a little bit out of place or inappropriate. He is not discussing Disneyland. He is discussing an orphanage. So it shouldn't be some sort of thrill. So the management at Boys Town were also failing to help the victims, much the same as the Omaha police and the FBI. And that is probably because they were all involved. The people who ran Boys Town were involved. The local police and the FBI were involved. The heads of the media were involved. And as the witnesses said, many rich and influential people were involved. So when the CIA is called in to do a counterintelligence operation, which includes media coverage, they will probably use one of their highest level agents who was involved in all of this to help cover it up. And that is John DeCamp, who also plays the role of Larry King. So Larry King is an invented character who is going to take the blame for all the rich and influential pedophiles blamed as the head of their ring. So they have their hero, John DeCamp, also playing the role of the perpetrator, Larry King. And they will have their hero, Senator Lauren Schmidt, also playing the role of the inept manager of Boys Town, Monsignor Hop. And this makes a lot of sense when you realize that influential members of the establishment are being named by the children as being their abusers. In a government conspiracy involving human trafficking, who would the government send in to act as saviors to these children? And the answer is more pedophiles, and the worst ones at that. So if Boys Town management is being accused of these crimes, the Boys Town management can then play the role of Senator Lauren Schmidt, who is the head of the legislative committee against child abuse in Omaha. And this is what organized government crime rings do. And they do this on a daily basis. This happens every day. But unless you analyze every one of their news stories, you will not notice it. So it's like being robbed by somebody and then going down to the police station and putting in a report with the guy who robbed you. It turns out the guy that robbed you was a police officer. So that police officer who robbed you is never going to solve the case, because if he does, that means that obviously he will go to jail. So this is what these military establishment organized crime members do. If something comes up about their crimes, the head criminals will have to handle the situation by acting as those who are there to investigate the crimes. That way, the corrupt establishment knows that nothing will ever be accomplished in exposing and prosecuting those who are really to blame. That is why there are so many crooked police departments and FBI offices, because the cops are always one of the first places that organized crime wants to infiltrate and take over. So when the children brought up the names of prominent people in the Omaha area, they probably named the head of Boys Town, the head of the Omaha police, President Ronald Reagan, and President George Bush. And they probably also named a big reporter on the news named Larry King, who was a television host on CNN. So once realizing that Larry King, one of the pedophiles in the pedophile group, is really John DeCamp, you will have to ask yourself, why would the creators of this story choose that name for him? Why would they call him Larry King? They could have called him anything. They could have called him Larry Anderson. So why choose to call him Larry King, which could be confused with the reporter, the famous reporter, Larry King? And the answer to that is, first, whenever John DeCamp discusses the case, every time he talks about it, every time he introduces one of the main people in the pedophile group, he has to make sure that everybody understands that he's talking about a different Larry King than the one on CNN. So the CIA are doing this to confuse the reports from witnesses in the Omaha area, who most likely named the reporter Larry King, the white man from CNN, as one of the pedophiles. So like I warned everyone, the story gets worse with each layer exposed. So now we are forced to realize that the Franklin scandal and the Conspiracy of Silence documentary is inventing characters who are not even real people, some of which wear silicone masks so they could act in more than one role. So we have the Senate working with Boys Town, working with the media, working with the English company who created the Conspiracy of Silence documentary, and almost their entire story is a fabrication to imitate and eclipse the real stories that were coming out about government conspiracies and human trafficking rings that commit pedophilia and murder. So, to say the least, that exposes that we really do not have a legitimate government anymore. In other cases, all over Omaha, witnesses were telling stories about children being kidnapped, treated like slaves, being violently raped, and becoming victims of snuff films and ritualistic murders. So the government had to get involved and use all their powers to capture everybody's attention and create a situation where all the real witnesses with so-called smaller cases would slowly lose their will to fight this thing. So to tell you a little bit about the greater Omaha, Nebraska area, it is a very large city with 1.3 million people, and it's home to 5 Fortune 500 companies. As everyone should know, the state of Nebraska is a giant farming community with masses of cattle farms and corn farms, with Omaha being its largest city. So in Omaha, they have a large orphanage called Boys Town, run by the Roman Catholic Church. So they have a huge supply of children that could be used as victims. And in Omaha, they have the Offutt Air Force Base, which is the home of Strategic Air Command. So to give you a little history on the Offutt Base in Omaha, in 1940, the military chose Offutt Field for a factory that built bomber airplanes for dropping atomic bombs, which they used on Japan. At the end of World War II, Offutt Air Force Base was used to demobilize soldiers that were returning from overseas. In 1948, Offutt Air Force Base became the headquarters for Strategic Air Command, which had been moved from Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland to Omaha. During the 1950s, Offutt Air Force Base housed a Royal Air Force facility for servicing England's bomber planes. So if you read between the lines, you will notice that England plays a role in the Offutt Air Force Base. In 1960, the Offutt Air Force Base installed Nike Hercules missile sites. They also put in several new dormitories and more than 2,000 family housing units. And at some point they built an underground bunker and command center. So, what is not going to be reported on Wikipedia is that the Offutt Air Force Base was also used as a testing facility for MK Ultra radio frequency experiments following the Vietnam War. After indoctrinating their soldiers into this program of directed energy weapons and mind control, they will first experiment on their own fellow soldiers and then experiment on the surrounding citizens of Omaha. A lot of these radio frequency weapon operations were then focused on using this top secret technology to attack land and farm owners, to take over their possessions, their property, and their children. Probably a lot of orphaned children who lost their parents due to these U.S. military domestic attacks wound up at the Boys Town institution. With agriculture as the heart and soul of Nebraska, the military designated Omaha and the surrounding area as one of their targets. The military's current goal is to take over all the land and farms in America for giant monopoly corporations owned by European countries like England. This is the truth about the New World Order. America is not a free, privately owned country anymore. It has been hijacked by European powers like England and Italy. Often, the military utilizes directed energy weapons and radio frequency mind control to take over all the farms and all the land in certain areas. Essentially, they use radiation weapons to inflict pain on certain citizens, which causes hysteria and mental problems, heart attacks and respiratory problems and cancers, and this results in the death of many people in those areas. The military calls this radio frequency technology silent weapons, and they pride their ability of taking over a country one key place at a time without alerting the populace or causing any noticeable destruction. They take out one target at a time, one family at a time, one farm at a time. When you hear about MK Ultra experiments or radio frequency or directed energy weapon experiments, I want to tell you that the military is way past its experimentation phase. They are actively using these weapon systems on its own civilians to take over all private property for European interests. So when investigating areas where things like rampant child abuse and human trafficking rings are exposed, the first thing that you should look for is the closest military base, because MK Ultra always plays a big part in all of that. So let's return to the subject of John DeCamp. Once realizing that John DeCamp is Larry King, everyone should also realize that John DeCamp is something like the head pedophile and perpetrator in these crimes. You could not find a bigger enemy of the witnesses who tried to expose these crimes than John DeCamp. So as everyone who took John DeCamp and Senator Lauren Schmidt and the Legislative Committee seriously and failed. Because of that, John DeCamp won one victory after the next, and through it all, he broke the public's will to fight these pedophiles on their own, as John DeCamp's witnesses got locked up, as John DeCamp's witnesses went into hiding. Meanwhile, John DeCamp says that he has won a lawsuit against some company that tried to sue him. He said he got more than $1, but less than $100,000. So it sounds like he did all right. So what this man is telling you is throughout this case, as women like Alicia Owens are locked up for perjury, men like John DeCamp win money in lawsuits. So that's all you hear in the Conspiracy of Silence documentary and all the subsequent reports. All you hear is about people going to jail and about people dying. And John DeCamp is the only big winner throughout it all, winning lawsuits, making money off of his book. What we have to realize is that a lot of this is fear programming from John DeCamp himself. He's the one who's telling you that everybody's going to prison and everybody's dying over this but him. He's winning lawsuits, he's selling books, and he's doing okay. So we have to start to see through men like John DeCamp. And I think the last thing I heard about Troy Bonner was that he died in a mental institution. And of course, that is not really true. Troy Bonner was just sent back to California to act in his next big role in Hollywood. So under the advice of John DeCamp's good friend, a man named William Colby, who is the ex-director of the CIA, John DeCamp writes a book called The Franklin Cover-Up. So according to John DeCamp, in his interview with Alex Jones, and also one with truthfire.org, John DeCamp says that his good friend, CIA Director William Colby, was found dead floating in a pond after giving John DeCamp the good advice to write the book, The Franklin Cover-Up. So again, this is a lie told to scare everybody who is looking into these subjects. To tell you a little about William Colby, he was the chief of the CIA's Far East Division, and he oversaw the Phoenix program in the Vietnam War. And the Phoenix program is an MK Ultra program. So William Colby was such a good military guy during the war that they promoted him as head of the CIA. So according to the pedophiles who are involved in human trafficking and mind control programs and starting wars with tiny countries in Asia, you could not find a better man than William Colby, and they promoted him to be head of the CIA. So to spell it out for you, here is another top pedophile, William Colby, being represented as some freedom fighter who winds up dead. So these two men, John DeCamp and William Colby, were called in to help their fellow pedophiles like George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. and Ronald Reagan and Larry King from CNN to cover up this issue in Omaha with an Eclipse, with a CIA operation called an Eclipse, a media eclipse. So one of John DeCamp's favorite people to work with on the Franklin scandal was Paul Benacci. So I've listened to a few interviews with Paul Benacci. One is a videotaped interview and appears to take place at a prison where Paul Benacci is incarcerated. The person interviewing Paul Benacci is supposedly Gary Caradori, who was the private investigator hired by the Nebraska Legislative Committee to investigate all these reports of pedophilia that were coming out in Omaha. And there is also a couple of interviews between Paul Benacci and a man named Ted Gunderson, who was an FBI agent And Ted Gunderson is the same type of man that John DeCamp is. So I watched all of these interviews and I studied Paul Benacci's behavior and what he had to say. And in my opinion, he appears to be a soldier who has undergone extensive MK Ultra programming. And when he is interviewed concerning his mind control, he discusses having multi-personality disorder and having over 100 different personalities. And throughout the interviews, he goes on for hours discussing all of these different personalities that he has. And it becomes confusing to listen to. So his report is honest to a certain degree. But what is never clearly stated is that these so-called 100 personalities, they are actually people who act as handlers of Paul Benacci. If Paul Benacci's brain is set up to be the receiver of information and he is sent on a mission, the military can connect any number of people to him who will act as his handler and will advise or transmit information to Paul Benacci, who will act as a roboticized soldier. For example, Paul Benacci will not need to know how to repair a computer if he has a computer expert connected to him that will talk him through every step of repairing that computer. That is why the military likes to have little brain-dead robots working for them, because they could simply be told what to do in any situation and will not need to go through years of training. They can program these robots to do anything. So they only have to send a certain percentage of their people to computer school. And then through the MK Ultra program, they can program any of their soldiers to act as computer techs. So one day they'll have Paul Benacci working as a computer repairman, the next as an electrician, the next as a doctor, the next as a carpenter, the next as a scientist. So he's the perfect agent that can play any role for the military from one day to the next. So they want their people set up to be robots that can be programmed to do anything. So of course this is very dangerous because these people have no training whatsoever. They are just being told what to do. So Paul Benacci will explain this as one of his personalities, one of his 100 personalities, is a computer expert. So that is not really true. In fact, he probably knows nothing about computers. So it would be unfortunate to get one of these guys to act as your doctor or your surgeon. But that is exactly what they have planned for you. So Paul Benacci's reports are confused, and he will never tell you the real information. But I could tell by listening to him that he is an MK Ultra soldier. So John DeCamp authorized Paul Benacci to tell the story of a snuff film that he was involved in with Larry King and the camera crew and with 2 other boys. So Paul Benacci wrote about this snuff film incident in his diary, and John DeCamp included that in his book, The Franklin Cover-Up. So John DeCamp also read that excerpt from Paul Benacci's diary on the Alex Jones show. So I want to warn everyone that it is a very evil and disturbing event that describes raping, torturing, and killing a young boy on film. So I'm not sure how old he was at the time, but Paul Benacci and another guy were ordered by Larry King to attack and rape a younger boy. This included violently biting the younger boy's private parts, and the younger boy was eventually shot in the head by Larry King and then put into the trunk of his car. Much like the Conspiracy of Silence documentary, they have re-edited this snuff film report. In 2007, I heard the Alex Jones, John DeCamp interview on YouTube. There was also a website with a written document that discussed this snuff film incident. If I remember correctly, I believe that they said that the excerpts were taken from Paul Benacci's book. So if that is correct, at some point the CIA considered that Paul Benacci should be the author of the book. However, I guess at some point they changed their mind and decided to have John DeCamp be the writer of the book, The Franklin Cover-Up. And in that book, they printed an excerpt from Paul Benacci's diary. So according to this document about the Snuff film that I read around 2007, they said that the location of the Snuff film was at a rural ranch around Sacramento, California. And I mention this due to the fact that John DeCamp is now reporting that this Larry King, Paul Benacci Snuff film probably took place at Bohemian Grove. So first, that is not what they said in 2007. I am positive of that. They never mentioned Bohemian Grove at all. Second, if real human sacrifice rituals took place at Bohemian Grove, they may have died down or ceased altogether due to the exposure of Bohemian Grove, not only by Alex Jones, but by another man that we are not allowed to even hear about. So on a side note, from what I remember reading, Alex Jones was not the person to first infiltrate Bohemian Grove. I remember reading around 2008 that an unidentified man snuck into Bohemian Grove with a camera and a gun. According to that report, the man got lost and was eventually caught by security guards who then had him arrested. However, the truth may have been that this unidentified man may have actually taken photographs or video of Bohemian Grove and then got out safely and then posted that video or photographs on the internet. And because of this, Alex Jones had to eclipse that story by quote-unquote infiltrating Bohemian Grove and releasing that footage on the internet in a documentary entitled Dark Secrets Inside Bohemian Grove. So Alex Jones copied that idea from a real activist. And again, Alex Jones is the same type of man that John DeCamp is. And I believe that Alex Jones's entry into Bohemian Grove was arranged by the military establishment and the management at Bohemian Grove. It was all planned out, much like the conspiracy of silence and the Franklin scandal. It's another Eclipse story. So I tried to look this up again recently in 2020 and then just the other day in December of 2021, and I cannot find that particular story anymore. But there are a couple of strange articles entitled Masked Man Enters Bohemian Grove and something about the Phantom Patriot entering Bohemian Grove. And there is also a report about some editor from Vanity Fair that was arrested for crashing Bohemian Grove. But none of these are the report that I read in 2008. These stories seem like a joke. So according to the original 2007 reports concerning the Paul Benacci Snuff film, they said that the Snuff film took place at an isolated ranch in Northern California and not at Bohemian Grove. People like John DeCamp and this YouTube channel called Free Range Humans may be saying that because they know that after the Bohemian Grove got exposed, they are not going to do anything more illegal. They may be even planning to allow the media in and take a look at their wonderful campground called Bohemian Grove. So on a side note, by exposing areas like Bohemian Grove, this is a way that citizens, that activists can make an area hot for the establishment so that no further crimes will happen there. It's a way to force the establishment to stop. So do not listen to their fear programming that everybody winds up dead, and continue to expose them whenever you can. So when we hear John DeCamp reporting what Paul Benacci said about a violent snuff film where a young boy was raped and killed on camera, John DeCamp is describing something that he was not only a part of, but was controlling. So when we hear the testimonies of John DeCamp's witnesses saying that Larry King was the worst pedophile that they knew, who was involved with all these terrible crimes and had all sorts of pull within the military and the establishment, they are really talking about their boss named John DeCamp. So John DeCamp has two sides to him. One side that needs to be seen as a good guy, but there is another side to John DeCamp that comes out when he puts his mask on, I guess. And in some cases, he acts as Larry King, the African-American pedophile and snuff film monster. And the truth is that he is probably proud of that side to him and what he has done. There's a side to him that wants to brag what he was involved in. John DeCamp, also known as Larry King, is a big scary guy within the MK Ultra, ritual abuse, and snuff film ring. So John DeCamp and the CIA decided to release information about a snuff film that they were all a part of to capture the spotlight and to subconsciously scare people so that John DeCamp is given a huge degree of respect so that no one will want to question him or how he handled the Franklin scandal. So based on this, I think that John DeCamp was the director of many snuff films. And I think that the snuff film that they mentioned involving Larry King and Paul Benacci was one that John DeCamp and the CIA would consider to be not as bad as the other ones that they were involved in. In other words, these snuff films get a lot worse than the one that they describe. So that is very disturbing to consider. So to explain some of this, as the general masses are taught to see horror movies as entertainment, you go to see a Friday the 13th movie where people are killed, and we're taught to see that as entertainment. The establishment insiders like to view snuff films and live murder shows, which they regard as entertainment. Oftentimes, these murders involve Satanism and the occult, due to the fact that these occult murders go back into ancient times and center around a blood-drinking practice that is regarded by many as satanic. The reason that they drink blood is because that after torturing somebody and scaring them to death, high levels of adrenaline are released into their blood. The cult members then consume the blood, which is like a powerful drug. This is why we may have read reports. This is why there are reports of satanic blood-drinking rituals where cult members carve pentagrams into their victim's chest or repeatedly stab their victims and then collect their blood in goblets which they drink. This blood-drinking practice is even symbolized in religion, such as when Jesus Christ blesses the wine and says to his disciples, "Drink it, for this is my blood that has been poured out for you." Because Jesus Christ represents the good guy who has fallen victim to the religious cult that controls society. There are also many reports of what is called Jewish ritual murder, where children like Simon of Trent were found repeatedly stabbed and drained of blood. So when these reports came out in the Omaha community of not only pedophiles raping children, but also killing them in snuff films and satanic rituals, this is an ancient practice that is practiced by the inner group of every religion. They are the secret societies, and this is their most guarded secret. In every country, the military and religion go hand in hand. People who are waking up to realize what is controlling our planet have to stop believing that religions are just spiritual and charitable organizations. At the heart of every religion is 1. Military conquest. 2. The goal of controlling masses of people. And 3. The ancient and occult practice of human sacrifice. So returning to the discussion of DeCamp, at some point they wanted to introduce another character to the Franklin scandal, and a man named Russell, or Rusty Nelson, was introduced. So I remember that Rusty Nelson had a couple of interviews on YouTube, and I saw those in 2007. So I recently looked him up again, and I saw that he was interviewed by a Michael Corbin, who is an investigative journalist. And he was also interviewed by a YouTube channel called Free Range Humans. And those appear to be the same interviews that I saw on YouTube around 2007. So the truth about Rusty Nelson is that he is a professional actor and a very well-known one, but he uses a disguise so that he will not be recognized as Leonardo DiCaprio. In the Free Range Humans video, they are using a widescreen format that stretches his face and his body and makes him appear very heavy. He is also wearing padding so that he appears fat, along with a very long and bushy beard that covers up most of his face. So the whole point is that you do not recognize him. But this is Leonardo DiCaprio. And once you listen to this interview on YouTube, you could tell that Rusty Nelson is a high-level insider who is used to playing roles. He is used to speaking in front of a camera, and he is used to being interviewed. So many actors like Leonardo DiCaprio will appear on the news or act in many roles on television, but he will never be recognized because they'll make him look like a fat, bearded guy. So not only does Leonardo DiCaprio work for big Hollywood directors, he also works for the CIA and MK Ultra. So for Leonardo DiCaprio to be involved in the conspiracy of silence, Franklin scandal reports shows that John DeCamp is a high-level member of the Central Intelligence Agency who wanted to bring in people that he trusted the most to help him pull off this Eclipse story. So by appearing in this forum, exposed Leonardo DiCaprio as also being a high-level member of the MK Ultra and pedophile group, along with every other person on the Senator Lauren Schmidt and John DeCamp team. Leonardo DiCaprio is another insider who is involved with everything that they claim to expose. He is one of the perpetrators of this. So after listening to this Russell or Rusty Nelson talk for 1 hour and 45 minutes, it is obvious that he is not only involved in this sort of thing, but he is a very sneaky spokesperson who is trained to talk in circles and avoid discussing certain aspects to the pedophile ring. At times he is a disinformationist, but for the most part he is discussing a little of what he knows concerning the underground MK Ultra and pedophile community. The CIA knows that in order to take over the spotlight and eclipse the real witnesses, they have to tell the public at least a little of what they know. And in this case, they tell the public a lot. Because in this case, it was very important that they hijack the anti-pedophile movement that was happening in Omaha. So I took some notes on the Rusty Nelson interview, and I will paraphrase some of the important things that he says. But again, his story is a fabricated one that is based on real events. What is interesting is that this is really Leonardo DiCaprio talking about what is happening in the MK Ultra and Occult underground. So there are some interesting pieces of information along with their fabricated story. So Rusty Nelson says that he was hired as a photographer for Larry King to take photographs for Republican Party fundraisers. And at first he had no idea that anything illegal was taking place. And when he finally realized that something was happening concerning pedophilia and occult crimes, he had seen that the police, the government, and very rich people were involved. So he did not know who to call to report any of this to. Concerning the pedophile parties where underage children were abused, Rusty Nelson says, and I quote, "These after parties were where your wildest dreams and worst nightmares took place." So these were the parties where they were abusing and hurting children. So with that quote, he is admitting to being there, and it sounds like he's enjoying things. Rusty Nelson says that there was another photographer who was videotaping snuff films and child pornography, and that photographer looked almost exactly like Rusty Nelson. That Larry King sent him to a hair salon where his hair was styled exactly like the other photographer so that they would look even more alike. He said he was also given expensive clothes to match what the other photographer was wearing. Even though Rusty Nelson fails to explain how he knows that, how he knew that other photographer was involved in snuff films, he does say the reason for that was so that Rusty could be used as a scapegoat in order to frame him. He also said that men like George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. and Ronald Reagan were there at these pedophile parties. So Rusty Nelson goes back and forth with his testimony concerning being at the pedophile parties and taking photographs of people engaged in sexual acts with children in order to blackmail them for Larry King and the CIA. Rusty Nelson continues to say that he was never involved in any of it, but just happened to have many photographs that could compromise pedophiles. So if you read between the lines, that sounds like he was taking photographs of people engaged in sexual acts with children, but he doesn't want to say that directly because that would implicate him to be someone involved in child pornography. Rusty Nelson also says that he met the writer named Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote the book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. He said that Larry King introduced him to Hunter S. Thompson, and that Hunter S. Thompson offered Rusty Nelson $100,000 to film a snuff film that Larry King would help to arrange, but Rusty Nelson refused. At some point in the interview, Michael Corbin asks Rusty Nelson how many snuff films were made, and Rusty Nelson answers that he did not know how many were made, only that there must have been many, because Larry King would be on a private jet 3 or 4 days a week, flying all around the country, and much of this was cloaked in secrecy. Rusty Nelson did know that Larry King would drive onto the Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, and he would not even be stopped by the guards at the entrance because they knew Larry King so well. And later in the interview, Rusty Nelson says that he was with Larry King when they flew Larry King's private jet to Area 51 in Nevada. And Area 51 is in Nellis Air Force Base. And at that location, Larry King and Rusty Nelson dropped off many children who appeared drugged and under mind control, who were then purchased by Saudi Arabians. So with that statement, Rusty Nelson implies that Larry King's private jet was taking off from the Offutt Air Force Base out of Omaha, Nebraska. So Larry King, also known as John DeCamp, was working directly with the U.S. military concerning human trafficking for the purpose of child abuse, ritual abuse, and snuff films. Rusty Nelson also said that at Offutt Air Force Base was where a lot of the MK Ultra mind control went on, and that Larry King was very good at mind control. And he said that Larry King had Ronald Reagan's direct phone number, and one day Larry King had to call Ronald Reagan because a daycare center that they were using for human trafficking had been closed by its owner. And after one phone call to Ronald Reagan at the White House, the daycare center was reopened for the pedophiles to use again. Rusty Nelson also states that 23 children were taken into the White House and were never seen again. And when asked, he says that they were probably killed. So the next thing of interest is the story of Rusty Nelson's final days with Larry King. So I took notes on what he said and tried to piece it all together. But what he is saying is unclear because he is leaving out certain details and often jumps from one subject to the next. According to Rusty Nelson, he not only worked for Larry King, but also lived with Larry King at times, like when they flew all over the country together. So in 1988, Rusty Nelson says that he was staying with Larry King in Larry King's apartment in Washington, D.C. So one night, a man walks into Rusty Nelson's room and starts to get fresh with Rusty Nelson. And Rusty Nelson asked the man, "What are you doing?" And the man explained, "Larry King just sold you to me as a prostitute." So Rusty Nelson said, "Okay, let me go freshen up." So he goes into the bathroom and he jumps out of a window, and then he goes straight to the airport and gets on a plane, and he goes back to Omaha or wherever he is from. Again, it is not clear. And at that point, Rusty Nelson stays at an old deserted farmhouse that his grandparents owned. So sometime later, Rusty Nelson says that his parents' house was raided and that his mom told the FBI where he was. So next, the FBI raids Rusty Nelson's house, this farmhouse, and Rusty Nelson is forced to move into his camper, and he drives all over the country. So what is never explained is why, after the FBI raids his house, was he allowed to pack up his camper with thousands of photographs and then leave? Because at some point later, Rusty Nelson is pulled over by the police and arrested. Rusty Nelson says that all of his photographs were confiscated, but most of the photographs were of landscapes and nature. However, some of his photographs were of the Franklin scandal. So he never explains what he means by that. He never explains if there are photographs of these drug and pedophile parties. So we don't know what he means. So then Rusty Nelson states that he was charged for taking photographs of a minor. However, the police could not produce the photographs nor the minor because a minor does not have to testify in court. However, she must have pressed charges which he had to go to jail over. In another interview, John DeCamp states to Alex Jones that the police contacted him when they arrested Rusty Nelson, found thousands of photographs in his van, and also a copy of John DeCamp's book, The Franklin Cover-Up. So the police saw that Rusty Nelson had underlined parts of the book, so they decided to give John DeCamp a call and tell him all about Rusty Nelson. So this does not make a whole lot of sense, but this is what John DeCamp said. So I guess that this was the way that John DeCamp met Rusty Nelson and eventually decided to work with him on the Larry King lawsuit, where John DeCamp allegedly represented Paul Benacci and sued Larry King for the abuse that he suffered. The result of that court case was Paul Benacci winning a $1 million judgment, but he doubts that Paul Benacci would even see a nickel of that, probably because it is a lawsuit for punitive damages and not for compensation. Regardless, I doubt that this court case ever happened because Larry King and John DeCamp are the same person. The last confusing statement from Rusty Nelson concerning the Franklin scandal is this. Rusty Nelson claims to have met the private investigator named Gary Caradori in Chicago. And Rusty Nelson says that he gave Gary Caradori photographs that would be the smoking gun proof to the case. So when Gary Caradori's plane crashed outside of Chicago, Rusty Nelson's photographs were some of the information they confiscated from Gary Caradori about the Franklin scandal. So Rusty Nelson thinks that the FBI tampered with Gary Caradori's plane to cause him to crash on July 11, 1990, before Gary Caradori could get these photographs to Senator Lauren Schmidt and John DeCamp for the grand jury hearing that took place around July 23, 1990. So first, Rusty Nelson never explains how he met Gary Caradori, who was the investigator to this case. He never explains how he came to meet him. And second, if both of these guys are from Omaha, why would they agree to meet in Chicago? Why would Rusty Nelson get in his car and drive 7 hours to Chicago to meet Gary Caradori, who had to fly into Chicago? If they're both from Omaha, why didn't they just meet somewhere around Omaha? After all, the grand jury hearing was coming up in 1 week. So again, I do not know where Rusty Nelson was living at that time. I assumed Rusty Nelson was from Omaha, but he may have been living in some other state. But the most important question is this. Why wouldn't Rusty Nelson be asked to be a witness at the grand jury hearing? If Gary Caradori got the court these photographs, I think their first question would be this: where did you get these photographs? So I think that Rusty Nelson would be sent an order or a subpoena to appear in court. So all of this illustrates that the Conspiracy of Silence documentary and all the subsequent videos concerning John DeCamp and Rusty Nelson and everyone else associated with them is just an intelligence operation that serves as a parallel reality to eclipse the real witnesses of Omaha, Nebraska.